The ballroom at Ashford Park blazed with 40 candles the night Millicent stood at its center and heard herself called a transaction. The word did not arrive as a whisper. It arrived in Mrs. Portia Leach's carrying voice, timed precisely between musical phrases, so that it fell into the silence the way a coin falls into still water, rippling outward through the assembled guests before anyone could pretend it had not been said. Millicent did not flinch. She had learned, in the course of 1 year as the Duchess of Ashford, that flinching only invited further scrutiny, and she had had quite enough scrutiny to last several lifetimes. She held her champagne glass steady, she kept her chin level, and she did not look at her husband. What she did not yet know was that her husband was already looking at her. She had been plain Millicent Vane for 23 years before the word Duchess attached itself to her name, and in those 23 years she had grown accustomed to a particular quality of attention, which was to say very little of it. She was the second daughter of Mr. Gideon Vane of Wiltshire, a gentleman of moderate means and immoderate warmth, whose principal legacy to his daughters had been a deep library, a good ear for music, and a debt of £4,000 contracted against the Ashford estate during a winter of failed investments and ailing health. When the debt came due and Mr. Vane could not meet it, the Duke of Ashford had offered a solution. He had offered Millicent, or rather, he had offered a marriage to one of the Vane daughters, and her older sister Clara had already been promised to a clergyman in Bath, and so it fell to Millicent with her brown hair and her neat, unremarkable features, and her gowns that were always somewhat behind the season's fashion, because there had never been money to spare for anything otherwise. Her father had wept when he told her. He had taken her hands across the library table in the house on Whitmore Lane and said that she did not have to agree, that he would find another way, that he could not bear it. And Millicent, who loved her father with the particular fierceness of a daughter who has watched him diminish slowly over 3 years of illness, had looked at his thin hands and his frightened eyes and had said that she was quite willing. She said it with the steadiness she had always worn as armor, but underneath it she understood exactly what was being asked and what it would cost her. She would be chosen because she was available. She would not be wanted. There was a difference, and she knew it. She arrived at Ashford Park on a Tuesday in late October, in a hired carriage that smelled of damp wool, wearing her best traveling dress, which was a dark green that had been let out at the waist the previous spring. The estate was older than she had imagined, and larger. Its stone the color of winter clouds, its parkland rolling away in every direction into a gray afternoon. A footman named Briggs met her at the door with the specific blankness of a servant who has been instructed to be civil to an inconvenient arrival, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Peel, showed her to her rooms with a courtesy that was entirely correct and entirely without warmth. Millicent put her small trunk at the foot of the bed, sat down in the chair by the window, and looked out at the park. She heard Mrs. Leach's voice in the corridor outside before she had been in the house an hour. The woman was Lady Dorothea Ashford's companion, a person of indeterminate middle age who wore her position as other women wore their jewelry, loudly and often. The voice drifted clearly through the door. "The Duke says she'll do." A brief, amused pause. One supposes that is high praise, in the circumstances. "She'll do." Millicent sat with those words for a long time, until the November light faded entirely from the window and a maid knocked to ask if she required anything. She said that she did not, and she meant it, because what she required was not something any maid could supply. The Duke of Ashford was 31 years old, with a face that gave nothing away and a quality of stillness that Millicent found simultaneously imposing and, in certain unguarded moments, unexpectedly sad. He had the jaw she would later think of as carved from the pale stone of his own house, and eyes the color of smoke over water. and he spoke in short, level sentences that held authority without apparent effort. He had been married before, she knew. His first wife, Eleanor, had died 3 years earlier. The household did not speak of Eleanor directly, but her presence existed in the estate the way a river exists in land it has carved. Invisible, but decisive, shaping everything around it. William met Millicent in the drawing room the morning after her arrival, and the exchange was brief and civil, and told her very little about him. He asked if her rooms were satisfactory. She said they were. He told her that Mrs. Peel would see to any arrangements she required. She thanked him. He nodded once, precisely, as though that concluded a piece of business, and returned his attention to the letter in his hand. She had expected nothing more. She received nothing more, and she told herself this was fine. She settled into Ashford Park the way water settles into an unfamiliar vessel, finding its own level quietly, without drawing attention to the process. She learned the house, its drafts and its warmth, its corridors that ran east toward the stables and south toward the library, its kitchen garden that Mrs. Peel supervised with military discipline, its upper floors where a small boy named Thomas had his nursery. Thomas was 7 years old, the son of William's younger brother, both of whose parents had died in a fever outbreak in Devonshire 18 months earlier. William had assumed his guardianship without ceremony, and from what Millicent could observe, with a kind of braced, functional care that was clearly the best he knew how to offer. Thomas was a quiet child with dark eyes, very like his guardian's, and he watched Millicent from doorways for the first 2 weeks, as though she might suddenly do something that required his full attention. The household's initial coolness toward Millicent expressed itself in small, calibrated ways. Briggs the footman delivered her tea last at table. Her letters were sometimes delayed a day before reaching her hands. At the first dinner with Lady Dorothea and 4 of her guests, the chair assigned to Millicent placed her at the far end from William, a placement that was technically correct and practically dismissive. Lady Dorothea herself was a woman of 60, with a bearing that suggested she had never in her life done anything incorrectly. Her silver hair dressed with precision, her fan held at a height that communicated the social order without a word being required. She called Millicent "my dear," in a tone that made the endearment feel faintly clinical. It was at that first dinner that Mrs. Leach spoke the words a second time, to the woman beside her in a lowered voice that was not low enough. "She'll do," the Duke said, apparently. "One cannot say the description has been surpassed." The woman beside her suppressed a smile. Millicent cut her meat with great care and allowed herself privately the single dry observation that at least the beef was good. She kept her own counsel. She directed her energies toward the small useful work of being present in the house without creating difficulty. And in this way, she gradually became a fixture that the household no longer found entirely worth scrutinizing. The first correction came in the 3rd week of November. Millicent had been in the entrance hall, speaking to Mrs. Peel about the rearrangement of the linen cupboard, when Briggs crossed behind her and said to a younger footman, loudly enough to hear, that the plain one had requested the good dinner service again, and he did not see why it should be brought out for a meal with no guests. The younger footman said nothing. Mrs. Peel went carefully still. William was 3 feet away, near the door to the library, and he had clearly heard every word. He turned. He looked at Briggs with a gaze that contained no anger, only a precision that was somehow worse than anger. He said, "You will address the Duchess of Ashford as your Grace, or as my lady, or you will find yourself another household. I will not say it again." He did not raise his voice. He did not look to see how Millicent received this. He simply returned to the library and closed the door. Briggs's face arranged itself into the expression of a man who understood he had committed an error of lasting consequence. Mrs. Peel resumed her precise discussion of the linen cupboard, and Millicent stood in the entrance hall with a faint, involuntary warmth at her wrist, as though something had briefly heated the cool air around her, and she told herself it was the fire in the grate. She told herself it was policy. He had corrected the servant because he could not afford the appearance of a disordered household, because rank required its rituals, because the correction had nothing to do with her specifically, and everything to do with the maintenance of order. She believed this with great discipline, because the alternative required her to consider that the man who had said she would do had meant something additional by his actions. And that thought was more dangerous than the cold. Thomas's fever arrived in December, sharp and sudden, the way winter illnesses arrive in old houses, without preliminary courtesy. The child burned through 2 nights, and the physician from the village came and prescribed willow bark and rest, and the removal of heavy draperies from the windows. His nurse, a stout woman named Agnes, sat with him through the days. But on the 3rd evening, Agnes's own head was aching, and she was visibly unwell herself. And Millicent, passing the nursery corridor with a book she had carried upstairs from the library, opened the door and looked in, and found Thomas awake and frightened in the firelight, his face flushed and his eyes too bright. She sat down beside him. She asked him if he would like to be read to. He said in a very small voice that he supposed he would not mind. She opened the book, which was a natural history with illustrations she had thought might interest him, and she began to read about the migration of swallows, and then about the habits of foxes in winter, and then about tidal pools on the Cornish coast. And by the time she reached the account of a gray seal colony near the Scilly Isles, Thomas had stopped watching the firelight with frightened eyes and had begun watching her with something closer to attention than fever usually allowed. She read to him for 2 hours. She did not notice the door standing slightly open, or the particular quality of stillness in the corridor outside it, which was different from the general stillness of the upper floor. She did not notice the shadow that paused there, or the fact that it did not move for a considerable interval. William had come to look in on Thomas at 9 o'clock, as he did every evening. That Thomas was unwell, because illness frightened him in a way that few other things could. Because illness had taken Eleanor and left him with 3 years of the specific guilt of a man who had been away and had come back too late. He stood in the corridor outside the nursery door and looked through the narrow gap at the plain young woman in the brown dress who was reading about seal colonies to his ward in a voice so steady and warm that Thomas had stopped shivering and was beginning to go slack with approaching sleep. William stood there and felt something shift in the place behind his ribs where he kept everything he had decided not to feel again. He would not have named it, had anyone asked. He would have said it was only relief that the boy was settled and Agnes could rest. He turned and walked back down the corridor without making a sound. But what he did not do, that night, or in the days following, was look at Millicent with the same quality of careful blankness he had maintained since October. In the evenings after that, when the household gathered, he asked her opinion of the natural history she had been reading. She gave it, briefly, with the characteristic caution of a woman who has learned that her opinions are tolerated, but not sought. He listened. He asked a second question. She gave a longer answer. He did not look away. She noticed, and she did not know what to do with what she noticed, and so she did the thing she had always done, which was to hold very still and wait for the evidence to resolve into something she could interpret without danger. In January, the snow came properly, and with the snow came Lady Dorothea's announcement that she had invited a small party for the winter ball at the end of the month. The winter ball was a tradition at Ashford Park that predated William by 2 generations, a gathering of the county's principal families, the neighboring estates, and the local gentry, roughly 40 guests over 3 days. It was the first such event since Eleanor's death, and its revival suggested, to those paying attention, that the household had decided to present itself as restored. Millicent understood what she was intended to represent in that presentation, and she prepared herself accordingly, commissioning a gown in a pale gray silk that was appropriate to her station without exceeding the budget she had privately set herself, because old habits of economy do not dissolve with a title. She did not know, until the afternoon of the second day, that Miss Cecily Frome was among the guests. Cecily arrived in a carriage with the Ashford family crest on the door, which was Lady Dorothea's carriage, which meant the invitation had been issued at Lady Dorothea's direction, and not, notably, at William's. She was everything Millicent was not. Tall, honey-haired, with the particular luminosity of a woman who has been told since childhood that she was exactly what the room required. She had apparently been the original intended match for William before Eleanor's family had been preferred, and though the facts of this history had never been stated plainly to Millicent, the household's reaction to Cecily's arrival communicated them with perfect clarity. Mrs. Leach led her to the best guest suite. 2 of the parlor maids exchanged a specific look that Millicent intercepted and filed without expression. Lady Dorothea introduced Cecily to Millicent in the drawing-room with the air of someone placing 2 objects side by side to let the comparison speak for itself. Cecily was gracious in the studied way of a woman who has been gracious to everyone her whole life and finds the practice no longer requiring effort. She said she had heard a great deal about Ashford Park, and that it was a privilege to finally see it properly. She said it to the room generally, which technically included Millicent, and yet somehow did not look at her while saying it. William was not present at the introduction. He arrived later, and his face when he saw Cecily contained a quality Millicent could not fully parse, something between recognition and restraint. And she understood then, with the cold clarity of a woman who has spent a year becoming very good at reading what she is not meant to see, that whatever Cecily represented in Lady Dorothea's calculations, it was something that had been thought about carefully and placed here deliberately. She wore her gray gown to the ball. The ballroom was bright with 40 candles in the chandelier and the wall sconces, and the guests had dressed accordingly. The women in satins and pale gauze, jewels at their throats, jewels in their hair, and Millicent moved among them in her plain gray silk, and felt what she had always felt at such gatherings, which was the faint but persistent sensation of wearing the wrong costume for the play everyone else had been rehearsing longer than she had. Cecily was in cream and gold, her hair dressed with small pearls. She danced the first set with a baronet, and the second with the Earl of Somerton's second son, and she moved through the room with the authority of a woman who had always been certain she was where she belonged. William stood at the edge of the floor for the first hour and did not dance. He spoke to 2 of his neighbors and to Lady Dorothea's solicitor, who had arrived with papers Millicent gathered related to some matter of the Ashford Trust. At one point his gaze found hers across the room and held for a moment, and she looked away first, because she was not certain what she was being told, and uncertainty in such situations had always seemed to her the better reason for caution. It was near the end of the second hour when Mrs. Leach moved. She had positioned herself near the center of the room, beside the widowed Lady Cranworth and her daughter, and when the music paused between dances, she spoke in the carrying voice she deployed with such reliable precision. The marriage was a transaction, she said, to no one specifically and to everyone in range. The Duke required a wife, and Mr. Vane required relief from a debt of £4,000, and so there it is. One does not pretend it is otherwise, and I am sure the Duchess herself does not entertain any illusions on that score. The silence that followed was not absolute. It was a drawing-room silence, the kind that has a great deal of sound underneath it. The rustle of a skirt adjusted, the clink of a glass taken up, the soft percussion of 40 people choosing at exactly the same moment to appear to be looking elsewhere. Lady Cranworth's daughter went slightly pink. Lady Dorothea's fan, just barely, slowed its motion. Millicent had spent 23 years preparing for this exact moment without knowing that was what she was doing. She heard the words. She felt them land in the specific place they were aimed at. The place where she kept the knowledge that she had been chosen because she was available. She felt the warmth leave her face, and the air in the room become very precise. She looked at Mrs. Leach with complete steadiness, and she said nothing. And then she thought of Thomas asleep upstairs. She thought of Thomas at 7 years old, in a house where grief had organized itself around his absence rather than his presence, a child who had learned to stand in doorways and watch for evidence that someone in the building was glad he was there. She thought of his voice saying he supposed he would not mind being read to. She thought of the natural history book with its illustrations of seals on the Scilly Isles. And she thought of the 3 nights she had sat beside his bed. And she thought of the look on his face the morning after the fever broke when he asked if she would come again. She set her champagne glass on the tray of a passing footman. She straightened to her full height, which was not considerable, but sufficient. And she spoke to the room in a clear, level voice, not loudly, because she had never had any use for volume. "What Mrs. Leach says about the arrangement is true," she said. "I came to this house to settle a debt, and I knew it, and I said nothing to the contrary. But I have been here a year, and in that year I have found something here that is worth my presence." A brief, deliberate pause. "The boy upstairs requires someone who comes back. I intend to go on coming back. I would ask anyone who finds that inconvenient to consider that it is not, in fact, their concern. If you have ever been present in a drawing room when a woman says the exact true thing in a voice that leaves no room for argument, you will understand the quality of silence that followed. If you have not, it would be difficult to describe adequately. It was the silence of a room rearranging its understanding of what it was witnessing. Mrs. Leach's mouth opened and produced no sound. Lady Cranworth made a small, soft noise that might have been admiration. And William Ashford, who had been standing 8 feet away and had heard every word, began to walk. He crossed the ballroom in 3 strides, which was not a dramatic gesture in the theatrical sense, which was simply the action of a man who had decided something and was carrying it out without further deliberation. He stopped beside Millicent. He stood there, and for one suspended moment he looked at her with the smoke-gray eyes that had given nothing away for 12 months, and what was in them now was not nothing. He turned to face the assembled guests. He spoke once, clearly, in the level voice of a man who has spent his whole life choosing his words precisely and understood the weight of these particular ones. "This is my wife," William said. "She is my choice, and she is my duchess, and she is the best thing in this house." He did not look at Cecily. He did not look at his mother. He did not qualify or soften it. Anyone who disputes that is welcome to leave. No one left. What happened instead was a collective recalibration, the kind that occurs in rooms where the most powerful person has spoken with finality, and the room has understood that the calculation it was performing is no longer relevant. Lady Cranworth's daughter began to applaud, which was slightly forward of her, but genuine. One of the neighboring farmers, a broad, practical man named Halkett, who had known William since boyhood, made a sound of approval that carried warmth without embarrassment. Cecily Frome stood very still for a moment and on her face was the specific expression of a woman whose script has just been rendered unnecessary. She was not humiliated. She was simply no longer relevant, which is its own particular reckoning for a woman who has always understood herself to be the correct choice. She set down her glass, spoke a brief word to the woman beside her, and moved toward the door with the careful grace of someone who understands that dignity requires an unrushed exit. She did not return to the ballroom. Lady Dorothea sat with her fan still and her face composed, and what crossed her expression was not calculation, but something older and quieter. She had been wrong. She understood she had been wrong. She would not say it tonight. And she might not say it in so many words ever. But she sat in the ballroom chair with the altered posture of a woman who has met a limit she had not anticipated and was adjusting her understanding accordingly. Mrs. Leach looked at her own hands. William offered Millicent his arm, and she took it, because there was nothing else to do, and because her legs had gone somewhat unsteady in the aftermath of everything she had just said aloud. He led her toward the side of the room, away from the center of the floor and the bright cluster of guests who were now talking as though they had always known the evening would end precisely this way. "Thomas will be glad," was the first thing she said, because she could not think how to speak about the larger thing yet. "Thomas has been glad for some time," William said. "I regret that it took me longer." He was looking at the fire in the side grate, his profile to her, and his voice carried the specific restraint of a man saying something true that he has held for a considerable interval. "She died because I was away," he said. And Millicent knew without a name being required that he meant Eleanor. "I was at the Northern Estate, and the message reached me 2 days late, and she was gone before I arrived. I had not intended to be in a position to fail anyone in that way again." He paused. "It appears," he said, "that I was in that position anyway, and that you managed better than I had any right to expect." She did not tell him that she had not managed well. She had managed. There was a difference, and she understood it. But she also understood that this was not the moment for that particular precision. She said after a moment, "You were not absent from Thomas." He turned to look at her then, and the mask that had been his face for the year she had known him was not present in the way it had always been present, and what was underneath it was not weakness, but something considerably more difficult to maintain than coldness, which was the willingness to be seen. "No," he said. "I tried not to be." The guests danced another 2 sets, and then the evening wound itself down in the way such evenings do, with carriages called and candles beginning to gutter, with coats retrieved and the last conversations sustaining themselves in the entrance hall. Millicent stood with William at the door as they departed, the Duchess of Ashford in her plain gray silk, her hand on her husband's arm, receiving the farewells of people who looked at her differently than they had when the evening began. Halkett shook William's hand and told Millicent she was exactly what the park required, in the straightforward way of a man who does not think in social codes. She thanked him and meant it. Lady Dorothea did not speak to Millicent that night. She retired early, her back very straight, her jewels still precise, and as she passed the doorway where Millicent stood, she paused for one brief moment. She did not say anything. She looked at Millicent with the clear eyes of a woman reassessing something she had built over decades. And then she inclined her head, a fraction. The kind of acknowledgement that costs a great deal from a woman of her particular formation. She went upstairs. Mrs. Leach followed at the appropriate distance, and she did not speak at all. The house quieted. The footmen extinguished the ballroom candles row by row, and the smell of warm wax carried down the corridor, to where Millicent sat in the small library on the east side of the house, the room she had made her particular territory over the 12 months of her residence, because it faced the garden and held the best collection of natural histories, and because no one else in the house used it in the evenings. She had not gone upstairs yet. She was not entirely ready for the night to close around what had happened. A letter lay in her hands. It had arrived 4 days earlier, forwarded from Whitmore Lane by her sister Clara, and she had carried it with her since and had not yet been able to open it. The seal was her father's. And her father had been dead for 3 weeks, gone quietly in his sleep in the way he had always said he wished to go, before the winter made traveling to Wiltshire necessary, and after the worst of his decline had eased, and the letter had been written, Clara told her, 2 months before the end, when he had still been lucid and purposeful, and in full command of the love he had always expressed badly, but felt with the wholeness of his considerable heart. She broke the seal. The letter was 3 pages in her father's hand, which she had always found beautiful, a Spenserian script from his schooling, still elegant even in illness. He wrote about the library on Whitmore Lane, and about a specific afternoon in her childhood when she had read to him from a geography of the Arctic while he was unwell, and how he had watched her face while she read and had understood then that she would be fine, whatever happened, because she carried her sense of purpose inward rather than outward, in the place where it was genuinely safe. He wrote about the debt and the arrangement, and his long guilt at having brought her to it. He wrote that he had wanted to find her a better door, but that this had been the one available, and that he had trusted her to know what to do once she was through it, because she had always known what to do once she was through the difficult thing, more even than she understood about herself. He wrote, in the last page, that she was worth more than anyone in the rooms she had moved through had thought to notice, and that he hoped someone had looked at her and seen it, and that if they had not, he would not forgive himself, and that if they had, she should please let herself believe it. His final line was brief. "I leave you to your good life, my darling, which I am perfectly certain you are already making." She sat with the letter for a long time. A coal shifted in the grate and settled with a soft sound. Outside the library window, snow was falling. Not heavily, but steadily. The first proper snowfall of January, covering the garden in the kind of quiet that can only accumulate in darkness when there is no wind. William came in without knocking, which he would not have done 3 months ago. He carried 2 cups from the kitchen, plain earthenware rather than the good china, because the kitchen fire was banked, and he had made them himself with the tea things left on the side table, rather than wake a servant for the purpose. He set one beside her and sat in the opposite chair, close enough to the fire that the light touched one side of his face. She told him, briefly, that the letter was from her father. He did not ask what it said. He simply sat with her in the room that was hers, by the fire that had been hers for a year, with the snow outside and the house settling into its night sounds around them. She looked up at some point and saw him watching her, not with the measured assessment she had catalogued and reinterpreted all year, not with the policy-maintaining attention of a man managing an arrangement, but with the open attention of a person who finds where he is, precisely where he had given up believing he would be again. She had been made to feel, for most of her 23 years and the first months of this 24th, that being seen was a thing that happened to other women. Women with pearls in their hair, and luminosity, and the correct kind of face. She had arranged her interior life around the assumption that it would not happen to her, and she had done it so thoroughly and so long that the assumption had calcified into something she no longer examined, because examining it was simply another way of finding it true. William reached across and took her hand, the one not holding the letter, and held it with the unhurried certainty of a man who has finally made his peace with wanting something. She let him. She let herself sit in the firelight of the library that had become her own, in the house that had become her own, and feel the specific, undeniable warmth of being present in a place where her presence was not merely tolerated. Earlier that evening, before she had gone down to the ball, she had paused in the corridor near William's study because she had heard Thomas's voice inside and had wanted to check that he was settled and well enough to be up. The study door had been open a few inches, and she had seen, before she heard Thomas's voice, that the portrait above the desk had been turned to face the room. Eleanor looked out from the canvas with the composed expression of a formal portrait, the painter's version of a woman, rather than the woman herself. Millicent had paused in the corridor and looked at the portrait, and thought about the 3 years in which it had faced the wall, and about what it meant that it did not face the wall anymore. She had not spoken of it to William. She had simply noted it, in the way she noted most things, and carried it carefully with her into the evening. She had understood then, though she had not quite let herself hold the understanding fully, that the wall had come down before the ballroom, that the turning of the portrait had preceded the 3 strides across the floor, that whatever had shifted in him had shifted earlier and slowly, the way rivers shift, without announcement. Now in the library, with snow at the window, and her father's letter in her lap and William's hand around hers, she let herself hold it. Thomas slept upstairs. The house was quiet around them. Outside, the snow continued its patient, accumulating work, covering the garden and the drive and the parkland that rolled away in every direction. And somewhere in the house, a clock struck the small hours with its measured, unhurried voice, and the fire in the grate answered with a small domestic pop of settling coals. She looked down at her father's letter, at his final line, "I leave you to your good life, my darling," which I am perfectly certain you are already making. She folded it carefully and held it against her palm, and looked at the fire, and at the window, where the snow was still falling. William did not speak. He did not need to speak. He simply held her hand in the warm library of the house that was hers, and the house held them both. And outside, the January dark pressed close and cold against the glass, while the fire inside burned with the steady, unhurried confidence of something that had earned its warmth. She was home. If Millicent's quiet courage moved you tonight, please leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you longest. It is a gift to know which part of a story finds the people who needed it. This narrator will be here when the next one is ready.